What if the world you know changed in 1945? In Paris, Nazi flags appeared on government buildings within hours of occupation. Across Europe, democratic institutions were systematically dismantled over several weeks, replaced by a single authoritarian government. This video explores the unsettling reality of a Nazi victory in World War II, tracing how their regime could have reshaped the global landscape and upended daily life. Would your city's language, laws, or even its currency survive when Berlin orders a single Reichsmark for all of Europe? The immediate aftermath of this timeline reveals a world transformed almost overnight. The immediate aftermath, a world reordered. Within weeks of a Nazi victory, the political landscape of Europe would shift dramatically. Nazi administrative units would replace local authorities, following patterns established during earlier occupations. The patchwork of democracies and monarchies would give way to a network of puppet regimes and local administrations loyal to Berlin. Borders would not remain static. Nazi planners, guided by Generalplan Ost, prioritized Eastern Europe for Lebensraum, aiming to reshape the region's demographics and resources to serve German interests. Territories deemed strategically or racially significant would be reorganized according to Nazi ideology, with millions subjected to one-party rule and the systematic dismantling of previous institutions. Fear and uncertainty would quickly settle over occupied populations. Resistance movements would exist, but the Nazi regime's swift and coordinated crackdowns would make organized opposition extremely dangerous. A regime-wide information campaign would dominate public life. Radios, posters, and local leaders would all deliver messages crafted to encourage compliance and suppress dissent. Collaboration would often be coerced. Those refusing to cooperate risked losing their jobs, their homes, or even their lives. For ordinary people, daily choices would become fraught, as survival increasingly depended on navigating a system where loyalty to the regime was constantly tested. Opportunistic collaborators would rise within the new order, deepening rifts in communities and eroding trust. The fate of Allied leaders would become a focal point in the early days after the Nazi victory. Churchill would have been a prime target. Historical Nazi intelligence operations show they prioritized high-profile figures in occupied territories. De Gaulle, as the face of French resistance, would face similar risks unless he found sanctuary beyond Nazi reach. Roosevelt, protected by the Atlantic, would be isolated diplomatically as Europe fell. Stalin's position would be especially precarious. As Hitler's ideological enemy, Stalin might attempt escape deeper into Soviet territory or seek exile, but his chances of evading Nazi pursuit would be slim. The removal or capture of such leaders would not only eliminate strategic opposition, but also strip occupied nations of symbolic hope. Visually, the continent would reflect the new order. Maps would show a greater Germany stretching across annexed regions, with national borders redrawn to fit Nazi priorities. Major cities, including Paris and possibly even London, would display Nazi symbols on public buildings, and parades would reinforce the regime's dominance. Cultural landmarks would be replaced or overshadowed by monuments to Nazi ideology. Libraries would be purged of banned books, replaced with texts that advanced the regime's worldview. Education, once centered on critical thinking, would become a tool for indoctrination, teaching loyalty to the state and adherence to Nazi values from an early age. Media and culture would be tightly controlled. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and films would all serve to reinforce the regime's narrative, erasing traces of the pre-war world that conflicted with Nazi ideals. Every aspect of public and private life would be monitored, leaving little space for dissidents to grow. Even so, the regime's efforts to suppress unrest would not eliminate the underlying desire for resistance. Forced displays of loyalty, property seizures, and the daily pressure of surveillance would keep tensions simmering beneath the surface. With Europe's old borders gone, how would daily life look under Berlin's uniform rule? We'll explore that next. Life under Nazi rule, society, culture, and suppression. Under Nazi rule, daily life would be shaped by a system built to enforce conformity and loyalty at every level. Schools, media, workplaces, and even private relationships would all be restructured to serve the regime's goals, leaving little room for personal freedom or dissent. Education would become a primary tool for control. Classrooms would no longer encourage debate or independent thought. Instead, Nazi education reforms would turn the curriculum into a vehicle for ideological instruction and skill training that fit the regime's needs. states. History lessons would glorify the Nazi state and erase the contributions or even the existence of other cultures. Biology would be used to promote racial pseudoscience. Organizations like the Hitler Youth would extend this indoctrination outside the classroom, training children to value loyalty to the regime above family or personal beliefs. It would not be unusual for a child to report parents or neighbors for statements seen as disloyal. Control of media and culture would be just as systematic. Radio broadcasts would be filled with speeches and music chosen to reinforce the regime's narrative of strength and unity. Newspapers would print only state-approved stories, while films like Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will would be promoted as examples of the new order's power. Books that did not align with Nazi values would be removed from shelves. Most pre-war literature would disappear from libraries, replaced with texts that advanced the regime's ideology. Art, music, and theatre would exist only in forms that celebrated the state. Creative expression would be tightly monitored, and dissenting voices would be silenced. For adults, the pressure would come from all directions. Minority groups, including Jews, Romani people, and others targeted by the regime, would face complete exclusion from public life. Jewish professionals would be banned from their jobs and forced into menial labor or worse. The Gestapo would monitor not just public spaces, but private conversations, relying on informants and anonymous tips. Public dissidents, religious leaders, and anyone suspected of opposition would risk arrest, imprisonment, or execution. Religious institutions would also face direct suppression. The regime's actions against Catholic and Protestant clergy are well documented. Thousands of pastors and priests were arrested or sent to concentration camps for resisting Nazi policies. Churches that challenged the official ideology would be closed or brought under strict state supervision. Over time, religion as an independent source of authority would be pushed to the margins, replaced by rituals and ceremonies that honored the regime itself. The daily reality would be one of constant surveillance and fear. People would be cautious about whom they trusted, what they said, and even what they read. Simple choices could have serious consequences. The isolation caused by this environment would erode community ties and make meaningful relationships difficult. Individuality and creativity would be stifled, replaced by a culture of enforced sameness and suspicion. This daily oppression paved the way for the regime's next phase, expanding beyond Europe. The global consequences: a new world order. The reach of a Nazi victory would extend far beyond Europe, shaping a new world order with Germany at its center. With no Allied resistance to counterbalance its power, Germany would dominate global politics, leaving other nations to adapt or risk isolation. The United States and the Soviet Union, once superpowers, would lose influence. The Soviet Union, after defeat, would see its territories carved up for German use, its people subjected to forced labor, and its government dismantled. Nazi plans for the East, outlined in Generalplan Ost, called for large-scale population transfers, resource extraction, and the elimination of opposition. The Soviet Union's collapse would leave the region fragmented and powerless, its population facing a harsh new reality. For the United States, the loss of Europe as an ally and trading partner would mean deep economic and diplomatic isolation. While the US would remain protected by geography, it would struggle to maintain its global standing. German naval strategy, including expanded U-boat patrols, would threaten transatlantic shipping and disrupt trade routes, making economic engagement with the rest of the world more difficult. Nazi control over Europe would also give Berlin leverage in forming alliances and treaties in Africa and the Middle East, as documented by diplomatic efforts through the Reich Colonial Office and negotiations with Vichy France. These agreements would allow Germany to secure resources and extend its influence into regions previously dominated by other colonial powers. Colonial territories in Africa and parts of Asia would become resource zones for the Reich. According to proposals from the Reich Colonial Office, Germany planned to maintain and expand its overseas holdings, using them to supply raw materials and labor for the war economy. Independence movements in these regions would find little support, as German interests lay in extraction and control rather than self-determination. Local populations would be pressed into forced labor, and resistance would be met with the same harsh tactics seen in occupied Europe. The Nazi economic system would be built on exploitation and enforced self-sufficiency. Reich economic planning documents emphasized autarky, with forced labor from conquered populations forming the backbone of industry and agriculture. Oil from the Caucasus, minerals from Africa, and grain from Eastern Europe would be redirected to fuel German growth. International markets would fracture as the Reich prioritized its own needs, leaving countries outside its control to contend with shortages and disrupted supply chains. Technological progress would shift toward military dominance. Projects like the V2 rocket, already developed during the war, would see further investment as Germany sought new ways to secure its power. Weapons research would advance rapidly, with innovations focused on maintaining the regime's grip rather than fostering cooperation or discovery. The threat of advanced weaponry would reinforce the sense of a world under constant surveillance and intimidation. Despite this global clampdown, underground networks persisted. What kept hope alive under the Reich's shadow? Conclusion: a Nazi victory would have meant a world shaped by fear and the loss of basic rights. Over 12 million people, including forced laborers from across Europe, would have been caught in a system built on exploitation and control. The scale of suffering and the erasure of entire cultures show the true cost of unchecked totalitarianism. Reflecting on how close we came to losing our freedoms can guide today's decisions. If you found this glimpse into an alternate past valuable, subscribe for more deep analyses of history's turning points and share your thoughts below.